So for a male to be sexually abused means that he's seen and sometimes sees himself as being something other than or less than a man. There's still a lack of acceptance that men and boys are victimized. When abuse takes place, the developmental process stops, and it doesn't start again until people begin to work on their recovery, work on healing. If you see recovery as, my life is going to be perfect, well, I don't know anyone whose life is perfect. If I want to make any point in this, it's that recovery is possible, that it's not easy, it's not simple, it's not quick, but things get better.
Couldn't take the blame, hoping for a change, but everything's the same. It's still the same. I'm running out of things to say. I need it yesterday. Oh, still I fall again and again.
Hello, I'm Lorward, and welcome to a conversation with Mike Lew, a monthly program devoted to education about healing from trauma caused by sexual abuse, presented by Voices Beyond Assault.
And I'm Craig. As most of us here today, Lorward and I are also survivors of sexual abuse. Voices Beyond Assault presents these programs because we understand that men and women who suffer sexual assault are not always heard. We want to amplify their voices, empower them to heal, and provide the resources that are needed.
And as such, we would like to first remind you that this program will contain discussions about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, and may also include explicit language. While today's program puts a spotlight on the healing journey specific to men, sexual assault and abuse is prevalent among all human beings, and our programs are all inclusive.
Today, we have a conversation with Mike Lew. Mike is a psychotherapist, trained cultural anthropologist, group leader, and co-director of the Next Step Counseling and Training Center in Florence, Massachusetts, and author of the most amazing book for survivors called Victims No Longer, the classic guide for men recovering from sexual child abuse.
Mike is a leading expert on recovery from childhood sexual abuse, particularly issues surrounding adult male survivors. Mike frequently lectures and provides professional training and additional workshops for survivors worldwide.
We want to thank you, Mike, so much for coming on our program today. Your book is absolutely amazing. It covers virtually every aspect of healing for male survivors. It's literally a workbook for adult male survivors. We have a lot we want to cover, so let's get right to it if you're ready.
Okay, let's go.
So the first edition of, and this blows my mind, the first edition of Victims No Longer was published in 1988. That is a long time ago. This was way before people were talking about childhood sexual abuse, let alone childhood sexual abuse for males. How did you happen to come about writing this book? And was it difficult to even find a publisher?
Actually, well, let me take those. Those are two questions, so let me take them one at a time. None of this was planned. When I first went into private practice, I had a very general practice about equal numbers of men and women, all sorts of issues. And almost all of it was short-term work because by nature, I'm not a terribly patient person. So the way I see it is if I were a doctor, I'd probably be a surgeon, open people up, take out the problem, sew them up, and send them away. But when I started working with trauma, I began to do longer and longer term work because that's what it takes. What happened was that the people I was working with, both men and women, started talking about sexual abuse, sexual trauma in childhood and adolescence. And I didn't have any particular expertise in this area, but I figured, this is an issue that lots of people are bringing up, and there were a few resources for women survivors. Not enough, but some, including those of Judith Herman, the work of Judith Herman and her colleagues. At the time, the only book that was reasonably useful was Judith Herman's first book called Father-Daughter Incest, which, as you can tell by the title, isn't particularly relevant for male survivors. She also wrote in that book at the time that boys were rarely abused, that fathers rarely abused their sons. This wasn't what I was hearing. And when I met her, I said, "How could you have written that?" And she said, "Well, I wrote this book 3 years ago. We just didn't know." So this was a rapidly expanding area of understanding. She also wrote in that book that group was the treatment of choice for women who had been sexually abused by their fathers. And I encouraged one of my female clients to join one of Judith Herman's groups for women. It moved her recovery forward exponentially. So I started looking for a group for some of my male survivor clients. And there was nothing. And there was nothing anywhere in the greater Boston area, which was where I was at the time. And it was a little surprising because in the greater Boston area, there are more therapists per capita than anywhere else in the world. And there's a group for everything. But there was nothing for male survivors in Boston, Cambridge, New England. And what I was hearing was, well, there aren't enough male victims to form a group. Well, I knew that couldn't be true because my clients were talking about it. My male survivor clients were talking about it. And, I didn't understand why nobody else was. I figured I had no expertise. I was not an expert on sexual trauma. And if my clients were talking about it, other therapists must be hearing it too. But nobody was talking about it. Nobody was writing about it. So what I did in classic male fashion was that I started complaining. And I complained to anybody who would listen, primarily Judith Herman and her female therapist colleagues. And to their credit, they let me complain a lot longer than made sense until finally the light went on. And I said, "Okay, I'll start a group." And they got very encouraging and very supportive. And I said, "But I'm terrified. I don't know anything." And they said, "That's appropriate. But don't worry, because the level of fear and shame and humiliation is so great that it'll take you a couple of years to get a group started." And so I ended up with 2 groups and a waiting list. So clearly the time was right. People were ready because, again, I didn't have any particular expertise in this area. But what I learned from my training as an anthropologist was that all behavior makes sense if you understand the context. And if you don't understand, if it doesn't make sense to you, it's probably either because you don't have enough information or because you're trying to impose your perspective on somebody who doesn't share it. So what you learn when you're training to be an anthropologist is how to listen. and try your best not to impose your preconceptions on someone else. So what happened was that even though I really didn't know much, I knew how to listen. And luckily for me, male survivors are very generous. They're the experts on their experience, and they taught me what I needed to know. And now that I've worked with survivors all around the world, I've worked in Australian Aboriginal communities. I've done workshops in Japan and Cambodia and South Africa and various parts of Europe, the US and Canada. And what I've learned is that if you approach people with respect, they respond. And as long as a therapist isn't defensive and isn't committed to being perfect, is okay with making mistakes, the experts will teach you what you need to know. And I continue to learn from male survivors, from people who care about male survivors, spouses, partners, children, etc. I don't believe I know everything, but I've learned a lot over the years, and I've learned a lot. Almost all of what I've learned has been from the survivors themselves. I've learned a bit from professionals, but the real experts are the survivors. They're the heroes of their own lives.
Mhm.
And you asked about getting a publisher.
Well, and writing the book, I mean, it had to take a long time to write this. It's
Actually,
not a short book.
it's a short book, but that's an interesting story. So I also started speaking up to anybody who would listen. I was going on local radio and TV shows. I was writing articles in newspapers and being interviewed for magazines, talking to community groups, etc., anyone who would listen. And I somehow managed to convince one of the producers of the Oprah Winfrey Show to do the first ever network television program on male survivors.
I remember it.
It was in 1987. And it was live because most television was live at the time. They flew me to Chicago. I was on a panel with 3 male survivors who were very courageous because, again, nobody was talking about it and there's a lot of shame attached. And I had to get right home for meetings after the show. So I left the show. They put me into a taxi right to O'Hare Airport, flew to Boston. When I got on the plane, the flight attendant said to me, "Didn't I just see you on television?" And so I figured, okay, here's the power of media. And when I got home, there were a bunch of messages on my answering machine. And one of them was from an editor publisher in New York. And he said, "I've been looking for someone to write a book on this subject. I think you're the person." I said, "No, I'm not. I've never written anything. I don't know how to do it. You've got the wrong guy." He said, "Come to New York and we'll talk." So, okay, free trip to New York. And he said, "I think you're the person to do it." I said, "I don't think so." And he said, "I'll help." And I said, "I'll try." So I went home, bought my first ever computer, one of those clunky little boxy Macs that don't exist anymore, called my 12-year-old niece and said, "Teach me how to use this thing," which she did with, a lot of eye rolling. And not knowing that it really wasn't possible because I had a full-time private practice. I was doing a bunch of groups, including some male survivor groups. I was in a relatively new relationship and was renovating a house. And I took this on top of it. And 9 months later, I gave birth to this book. So
So the publisher found you.
he found me. And I guess I didn't know that what I had taken on wasn't really possible. So I went ahead and did it. There are people who have said, that I didn't. Some survivors have said to me, "You've plagiarized my life. You're writing about me." Somebody else told me that I didn't write the book, I channeled it. And I think that's fairly accurate because what I did was listen carefully to what I was told and put it down in a way that it seems that other people can hear it and accept it. And I think it was very fortunate because there was such a need for this book that if it was a bad book, people would still have latched onto it. And it could have done a lot of damage. But luckily, it wasn't a bad book. It wasn't perfect. It got better in the second edition, a really good editor. But if I knew then how much I didn't know, I probably never would have written the book.
Hindsight always 2020.
Mhm.
That's a great segue into our next question. You wrote this book very early on. You realized, hey, there's a lot of things that I still don't know about what is happening here. You publish your second edition or a newer edition since it's first published. I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes in terms of attitudes towards males who suffer from child sexual abuse, men's willingness to come forward, or the general culture surrounding this topic. Can you kind of give us a little glimpse into what's changed and what have you noticed and what gives you a little bit of encouragement about the trajectory of where we're going?
Oh, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot over the years, again, from the experts. I think what's changed in many places, but not everywhere, is the understanding that we're talking about the sexual abuse of children. We're not talking about men and women. We're talking about child abuse that takes a sexual form. And I think we've learned that a far greater percentage of males than we previously knew are victimized as children and adolescents, that there are still not nearly enough resources, not even for women survivors, but certainly not for male survivors, and also not for the partners and family and friends of survivors who were affected by the abuse as well. And, as few resources as there are for male survivors, there are even fewer for partners of survivors, for people who care about them. And they will often feel like, I don't have a right to have feelings about this because it wasn't done to me. But everyone is affected by this. It's a toxic environment. Certainly, there are more resources, a lot more resources than there used to be, including your organization. But as you know, change is frustratingly slow, and there are never enough resources. We do the best we can. There are certain parts of the world that have been more advanced with these issues. Notably, New Zealand has an impressive array of services for male survivors. Norway, England, some parts of Canada, some parts of the US, but not nearly enough. When I edited the book for the second edition, I made two major changes, in addition to just kind of editing it because it had all of the the flaws of a first-time author. I overwrote the book. I took out a bunch of sentences and parts of sentences. But the two big changes I made was I put in a new chapter about sexual abuse by clergy, and I put in a section, couple of sections on groups and works, the importance of groups and workshops, because I've become increasingly convinced over the years that at some point in recovery, it's essential for survivors to meet and talk with other survivors, and especially male survivors talking to other male survivors, to cut through the isolation, because sexual abuse is a situation of isolation. And, abuse happens in secrecy. And recovery has to happen in the company of other people. But it's tricky because isolation can feel like safety. If I'm by myself, nobody's going to hurt me. But that's not true, because what isolation does is it allows all of the negative messages, all of the abuse messages, all of the hopelessness and helplessness to run like a tape loop with nobody to interrupt them. I can't tell you how many times I've heard men say, I thought I was the only one. And when they hear their story coming out of someone else's mouth, that turns things around profoundly. There's one guy who was in one of my groups for a long time who used to say, when I'm out in the world, it feels like everyone is speaking a different language than I speak. And when I come into the male survivor group, I don't have to translate. People get it. And that's hugely important.
Yeah, and you talked about workshops for a minute, and I want to talk a little bit more about that later on. But you've held workshops for survivors yourself, right? You've led them, and they've been in virtually every corner of the world, as you said. You've met survivors from very many different cultures. What are some of the similarities and differences among male survivors in these different cultures that you've recognized? You mentioned like New Zealand has a lot more resources, but do they accept male sexual abuse survivors more than they do in other countries or here? And
I think probably they do. Thanks to the efforts of a small number of male survivors in New Zealand who have taken on, there's a guy named Ken Clearwater who started the first services for male survivors in Christchurch, New Zealand. And now his organization, the Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse Trust, has, I think, 9 or 10 centers in various cities around the country. But to do that, he had to take on the political system, the educational system, the church, the police, boarding schools, etc., medical establishment, the psychiatric establishment. And he did it because he's tough and relentless, and he was right. And Ken is a guy, he's a working class bloke. He was a butcher by trade. He worked in a meat packing plant. He was a prize fighter and covered with tats, but he was relentless. He wouldn't let anything get into his way. And he made huge change possible in his country.
Are there other countries where they weren't treated so well that you were in, that it was a taboo?
Oh, I think it's a taboo in most countries. And we did the first workshop for male survivors in South Africa. And that was, there was a lot of prejudice that had to be overcome there. It's hard. There's still a lack of acceptance that men and boys are victimized. And I think that although I think it's too bad that we accept the sexual victimization of females, the fact that we do means that we can work to create resources. If you don't recognize that a problem exists, there's no motivation to create resources, because the numbers don't include people who haven't reported, who have reported and not been believed, who have disclosed and have been further abused. And I think that you don't have to be shut down too many times to know that it's not safe to talk about it. So not based on any research, my impression is that the numbers are probably about equal, and that the numbers are probably closer to 50%, and that's a tragedy. But I think that the reason people resist it is that, men are supposed to be tough and strong and take care of things. Often that translates as violently. So for a male to be sexually abused means that he's seen and sometimes sees himself as being something other than or less than a man, which means that he's seen as weak or female or gay or whatever it is. And I think that where that comes from is that we forget that we're not talking about the victimization of men. We're talking about child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about men and women perpetrators harming boys and girls.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite lines that I quote in Victims No Longer is, if you hit somebody over the head with a frying pan, you don't call it cooking.
Yeah.
A man abusing a little boy is no more a gay relationship than a man abusing a little girl is a heterosexual relationship. In both cases, it's child abuse. And the fact that we don't get that automatically speaks to our discomfort, both with child abuse and with sexuality. And when you put the two of those together, people get irrational.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the reporting. I mean, I didn't come to terms with my abuse until 7 years ago. I probably would have even denied it to most people. But when I talk to men today, and I say what the work that I'm doing with Voices Beyond Assault, interestingly, a lot of men say, "Oh, yeah, my coach did something to me, or this, oh, but I'm okay. I don't need to, go forward, and I don't really talk about it. I really haven't told anybody." And they almost don't see it as abuse. It's really interesting, I find.
Yeah, it's true. And also, if the body responds at all, it's to the perpetrator's advantage for the child victim not to define it as abusive. And, the body can respond. Men are less able to hide arousal than women are. And if there's an erection, if the body responds to touch, even if it's not pleasurable, but sometimes there is pleasure attached, then it's less likely to be defined as abuse. And if it's not defined as abuse, it's less likely to be disclosed. It's less likely to be reported. And the abusers are just fine with that because it allows them to continue to abuse. But there's a huge difference between an erection that's based on pleasure and arousal that's based on fear or confusion or, anxiety. And to understand that, I mean, anybody who's ever, say, as a kid, if you've had to speak in front of your class or at a school assembly and you have an erection, there's nothing pleasurable about that experience. It's deeply humiliating. The erection is the same, but the meaning is quite different. And there's a really fine line between arousal from pleasure and arousal from anxiety. And there's what the child victim and the adult survivor are responding to is lies about what was done to him. Oh, you must have enjoyed it. You must have liked it. You must have wanted it. And that's not the case. But perpetrators can be pretty crafty about the lies. If you're taught lies, that's what you learn, especially if the lies are coming from people who are supposed to know better and care about you. And that's such a shame. Often parents will say to me, how can I make sure that my child isn't harmed in this way? And what I'll say is, well, first of all, you can't. You can't guarantee it. But what you need to do is you have to be a safe place for the child to talk about anything. And when I say anything, I don't mean just the things that you're comfortable with. So, because if the child can't come to you with anything, when there's something really important, he's going to know it's not safe to talk about. So this includes, if your child says that he or she is sexually active or gay or whatever it is, you have to be okay hearing that because it's important that the child be able to feel safe enough to talk about anything.
Yeah. So you wrote about the difference between the words victim and survivor. And you also say it's recovery that we're striving for. Can you expand on that a little bit about those differences of those words?
Well, I'm not thrilled with the term survivor either, because, survivor I only use the term victim when I'm talking about the child while the abuse is taking place, or people who didn't survive, because many people don't survive the abuse. They've suicided, they've been lost to drugs or alcohol, they've been locked up in mental hospitals. So I use the term survivor to refer to people after the abuse has taken place. And it's not ideal because the term gives you the impression of clinging by your fingernails to the cliff edge, which I think is a pretty accurate image. But, it's the most widely accepted term. People have suggested other things like thriver, because thriving is the ultimate goal. Some groups in California for a while were using AMAC, adults molested as children. But to me, that sounds kind of robotic, I am an AMAC, that sort of thing. Um, I was once doing a training for professionals. I think it was in Sacramento, and I was whining about the lack of a really good term. And a woman in the audience said, "How about Victor?" And I thought, hey, that works for me. Doesn't have to work for everyone, but victory is what we're after. And, but for now, I've been using survivors because that's the most commonly used term
Yeah, for
uh,
men and women, right?
for men and women. What was the other part of the question?
Recovery. So you say it's really recovery that we're looking to do, and yeah, explain recovery. Is that like thriving?
Yeah, kind of. I think the literally to recover means to take back something, and something that was taken away. So, or getting over something like an illness. So I think that what is recovered in this process is one's sense of self, one's power, one's agency, one's autonomy. And that's not an easy process, but I think people have to come up with their own definitions of recovery, and what works for one person might not work for another. There's, but I think realistically, if you see recovery as, my life is going to be perfect, well, I don't know anyone whose life is perfect.
Right.
I've heard people say, well, I just want to feel good all the time. And I'll say, well, that's very nice, but that's not the way it works. You'll feel good sometimes, and other times you won't. And it's not linear, it's not simple, it's not easy, it's often painful, it's sometimes confusing. The overall trajectory is upward, but it's not linear. So, you'll think you've dealt with some aspect of it, and then it'll sneak up behind you and hit you on the back of the head, uh, which is one of the reasons why I suggest that people might find it helpful to keep a diary or a journal, because then you have some perspective over time. Well, maybe I'm not doing as well this week as I was last week, but look where I was a year ago.
Oh,
Overall, things are better.
it's a continuum.
It's a continuum, and it's not linear, it's not simple, it's not easy. And the reason why people have a hard time with it is not because they're stupid or weak or incompetent. It's because it's hard, and anybody would have a hard time with this. This is a difficult and
Yeah.
long-term process. I had a client once, a guy I was working with for quite a while, and when he did his last session with me, appropriately, he had done the work he needed to do. He said to me, my life isn't perfect. I still sometimes argue with my wife and get short-tempered with my kids, and I haven't written the great American novel, and I still, I don't have the perfect job, but I no longer spend a single moment wishing I were someone else. To me, that works as a definition of recovery, but
Yeah.
maybe not for everyone.
So you spend a lot of time in the book talking about what it is to be a man in the context of sexual child abuse, without diminishing the effects on women at all. And I know you take great lengths to state that. How did you find that these effects were different for men?
Well, there's a great deal of overlap because, again, we're talking about child abuse, an aspect of child abuse. But I think, we live in a sexist society. We live in a homophobic society. And I think we have certain expectations of males that are not the same as our expectations of females. And one is that, men can take care of themselves and protect themselves and all of that without realizing that, we're talking again about children. Um, I think at some point in their recovery, all the many male survivors I've met ask themselves some variation of one question. And that question is, why me? Why was this done to me and not to any other little kid?
Right.
And, because, the child victim is isolated and he doesn't know it's being done to millions of other little boys. He just knows it's being done to him, and he thinks it's because there's something deficient about him. So the question gets asked somewhat differently by heterosexual male survivors and gay male survivors. It gets asked somewhat differently if the abuser is a male or a female. And do you want me to run through this quickly?
Yes, sure. Yeah. I mean, chapter 4, you talk about sexuality, homophobia, and shame. So it's right into how that relates.
Yeah. Well, in the case of a heterosexual male who was abused by a man, the question is, why was this done to me? What does this mean? Does this mean that I'm really gay? Even if he's never felt any same-sex attraction, he worries that he might be in denial, he might be repressing something. And in his work, he needs to be able to voice that, including to voice his own feelings of homophobia, his own fears about it. In the case of a gay male who was abused by a man, the question is twofold. The first is this what made me gay? And there is no evidence that I know of, no compelling evidence, either clinical or research, of a causative connection between childhood sexual abuse and adult homosexuality. It doesn't create, we're not talking about a gay relationship. We're talking about child abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And, but the fear is there. And I've worked with guys who have, when they realized that their same-sex attraction predated the abuse, they were not happy about it because now they had to deal both with the abuse and their internalized homophobia. What it does create, rather than creating sexual orientation, is it creates confusion, because a child is being exposed to adult sexuality before he's developmentally ready for it, and he's not being exposed to healthy adult sexuality because healthy adults don't have sex with children.
Mm-hmm.
Healthy heterosexual men have sex with women. Healthy gay men have sex with other men. Having sex with a child is abuse. And again, we haven't gotten there as a society to really understand that.
Yeah. I mean, when I was 9 years old when my abuse started, and I didn't really know what even homosexuality was. By the time it was getting to the point where I was going to end it, when I was nearing 14, I was homophobic. I was afraid that he was trying to make me gay, he led a heterosexual life too. And I remember one time, to try to stop him, I said, you're gay. You're doing gay things to me. You're gay, right?" And like it was going to be some terrible thing, and it didn't stop him, of course, but it it's interesting how homophobia isn't a hatred necessarily of gay people. It's a fear that you might be labeled something that you're not, or something you don't want to be, and sometimes you can't help that how you were formed as well. So, in chapter 4, you do talk about sexuality, homophobia, and shame. And so, how do you see those three things being related as they apply to survivors of male sexual abuse?
Well, anybody who is a gay male has gone through some kind of process of coming out, of understanding, of working through shame and negative messages about it. I said that the one question that the easier question that gay male survivors ask is this what made me gay? The more tricky question is, was this done to me because I'm gay? And I think sadly, because we have a homophobic, sexist society, the answer to that question is often yes. Not because anybody deserves to be abused for any reason, certainly not for their sexual orientation, but we have very definite ideas in our society about how little boys and little girls should look, act, what they should be interested in. We pay lip service to valuing diversity in our children, but in fact, we insist on gender-based conformity. And I think this is an area where it's harder for males than for females, because as a society, we have more room for a tomboy than we do for a sissy. And so a child who doesn't fit our stereotype of how little boys should look, act, and what they should be interested in is more likely to be isolated. And an isolated child is more likely to be a fertile field for a sexual predator. So this is not just if the kid is gay, but if the kid is different, if he's not interested in sports or trucks or cars, if he's academic, if he's creative, if he's pretty, if he's, if he's not tough and all of those things, he's more likely to be isolated.
It's so interesting because, and I haven't heard that before, that there is a higher propensity of males who were sexually abused as children who are gay. But it makes sense because all of my gay male friends who I talk to and know about my abuse, they all tell me it happened to them. It's like, seems like 90% are telling me that they had some abuse as a child. So it makes absolute sense. And it's very interesting. So it almost says that we need to protect our children even more if they're isolated, because that's even they're a target.
Yeah, and I think that this is a tragedy because what we're doing is sacrificing our children on the altar of gender-based conformity. I'm not sure that, the vast majority of the men in my groups and the men that I work with, the majority are heterosexual. But there's always that fear of, what does this mean, especially when it's a male perpetrator.
But maybe gay men don't even come forward as much because they feel like they deserved it, or because they're gay and people wouldn't believe them because they must have wanted it because you're gay and all this stuff. There, it might be underreported more in the gay community.
They hear that. They hear that a lot. And so it affects everyone negatively. But I think that certainly there's a greater percentage of gay men in my groups than there would be in the general population. But one possible explanation for that is that people in underserved and people in minorities, including sexual minorities, have had to advocate for services for themselves, create services for themselves. So women have done that, creating women's consciousness raising groups in the past. People with AIDS have had to create services for themselves because of the stigma attached. Similarly, this is true of male survivors. So it might be that a greater percentage of gay kids get abused, but it also may be that gay survivors are more likely to talk about it and to
Okay. So you think they are more likely to talk about it?
seek services.
Okay.
But first, to do that first, they have to work on their own internalized homophobia. The other aspect is there's a further complication when the abuser is female. And there are several complications there because, we haven't as a society accepted the fact that there are female abusers. For a long time, the stereotype was that all abusers are male, all victims are female. Well, that gets in the way. That's contrary to the lived experience of survivors.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's an additional problem if the abuser is female, because boys are supposed to be little men. And men are supposed to be up for sex with women under any circumstances, regardless of the subjective experience of the child victim. So if a male is abused by a female, it's less likely to be seen as abusive. Oh, you're lucky. You got it when you were 12. I had to wait till I was 20. It's less likely to be disclosed. It's less likely to be seen as abuse by the child victim. And once somebody discloses and is shut down, he knows it's not safe to talk about it. I'm supposed to be aroused by sex with women under any circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not, that means that I'm probably gay, not that this isn't what I want. This isn't the woman I want to have sex
Well,
with.
they had movies where it's a conquest for
Mhm.
a young boy to have sex with an older woman.
Yeah, or an initiation into manhood.
Yeah, Risky Business is a good example of that. Even she
So
was
there's
older and he was
yeah,
younger.
and there's that confusion. If if the body responded, if I liked it, if I enjoyed it, then it wasn't abuse. If the body didn't respond, then I must be gay because the
Mm-hmm.
body's supposed to respond. So where do you go with that? So it's a
Yeah.
no-win situation, regardless of the sexual orientation or the gender of either the child victim or the adult perpetrator.
Yeah, in your book, you also say that it's very important for the to men for their healing journey to be able to express their emotions and feelings. And you talk about the ability to cry, the ability to laugh. You also talk about anger playing a role in healing. How does anger play a role into the healing process for men?
In many ways. And I think one of the confusing parts is that we have another stereotype that women are in touch with their feelings, women are emotional, men are rational. And if men are allowed any feeling, it's anger. We're not, you've heard all the statements, don't be a baby, don't be a little girl, don't be a sissy, big boys don't cry. Um, the other confusing part is that men are often afraid of anger, and because anger gets confused with violence. So if I'm only allowed one emotion and I'm terrified of that emotion, where does that leave me? The reality is that both men and women are emotional and rational, that they need to have access to the full range of available human emotion. That can be confusing, that can be scary. But, when I first started doing my groups, I did them with a longer cycle because I thought that men would have a harder time getting to their feelings. And, I accepted that stereotype and I was disproven. I mean, in the first meeting of the group, men were crying, men were raging. And it's not just rage, I see it as outrage. This is wrong. This is wrong, and I will not accept it. And that's powerful when when guys get in touch with their outrage, but it also involves, this is a loss. Losses have to be grieved. Massive losses have to be grieved massively. And so hours and hours of crying at some point is often part of the process. And grief is a reasonable response to loss. It's a healthy response to loss. Fear is a healthy response to danger. And outrage is a healthy response to what's outrageous. And this can be very confusing.
Yeah. Do you think anger is important part of that people need to have a period of anger in order to heal, or is everybody different and it's not necessary? Or
Yeah, I don't know that I don't think there's one size that fits all. For some people, it's really important to express anger. I think what's more important is to feel and be able to express one's feelings, because I think we have another stereotype that's, if you ask any kid, what's the opposite of happy? They're going to say sad, right?
Mhm.
Well, I think that the opposite of happy or sad or angry or confused or scared, the opposite of all those feelings is numbness. It's not feeling. And numbness is the enemy. Emotions allow us to be human. So, there are times when you'll be angry. There are times when you'll be sad. There are times when you'll be scared. There are times when you'll be happy. And there's also a mythology that we're only supposed to feel one thing at a time. I don't know if you've ever seen the chart in a therapist's office with all these kind of smiley faces and representing
Yeah.
different emotions, and you point out what you're feeling. Well, I encourage people to get rid of those charts because we're complex creatures and we can feel anger and relief and joy and confusion all at once.
Mhm.
But because we're taught we're only supposed to feel one thing at a time, when we feel a complicated array of emotions, we think we're going crazy.
Yeah.
We're really going sane. And I think that there's also a whole range of human emotions that we don't have names or definitions for. And when we feel those, we really think we're going crazy because we can't label what we're feeling. But the enemy here is numbness, not, not any kind of feeling. And there's a huge difference between anger and violence. Anger is an emotion. It's no better or worse or more or less dangerous than any other feeling. Violence is a behavior, and it's one way to express anger, but not the only way. But if you come from a violent family or a violent environment where anytime somebody raises a voice, somebody's going to get hurt, you're not going to believe that there's a difference between anger and violence.
Right.
So what does he know? I know differently. But the reality is that anger is not a dangerous feeling. Violence is dangerous.
So that brings up a point where in your book where I was had a question. So you say at one point that the male survivor may see himself as a victim, he may see himself as a protector, and he may see himself as a perpetrator. And that kind of like, whoa, a perpetrator, how and why would he ever see himself as a perpetrator?
Let me quote Judith Herman on this one, because she has written what to me is the best professional book on sexual violence and recovery. It's called Trauma and Recovery. And she says that sometimes child victims define themselves as perpetrators because the world of abuse is all or nothing. It's abuser, victim, it's powerful, powerless. And if I define myself as being responsible, as being the perpetrator, I have a sense that I had some power in the situation. If I wasn't, then I'm just a helpless victim, and it can be done to me at any time, anywhere. So sometimes there's a comfort in defining themselves as responsible. And it's not accurate, but it's understandable.
So these are ways that sometimes people view themselves, but they need to heal from that because they don't want to see themselves as victims all the time either. And they don't want to see themselves. So that's kind of saying it was my fault if you're a perpetrator because I was the perpetrator in this case.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in most of the world is not defined by victim or perpetrator. There's room for a lot of other roles and nuances, but not in the case of child sexual assault. It's all or nothing. And we're looking at survival. So in this case, it's necessary to expand one's view away from all or nothing and powerful, powerless.
Mm-hmm.
There's also perfectionism that a lot of male survivors experience that, for most people, a lot of life is about preference, about choice. For most people, if they say, do you want chocolate or vanilla ice cream? That's just seen as a preference. And some people prefer chocolate, some prefer vanilla, some it changes. But what you'll hear from male survivors frequently is, which one should I choose? What's the right choice? Even to menu items. And that's an exhausting way to live, having to get it right all the time because it feels like a matter of survival to get it right. Because at one point it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. So sometimes, and you touched upon this briefly, men are abused as adults. And I know that's not necessarily the work you've been doing, but there's even a television series dealing with this right now that everybody's talking about, where a male adult was abused. It happened to be a female. How are the effects different, or the same when this happens? And is there a connection to being sexually abused as an adult to being sexually abused as a child? If you're abused as a child, is it connected when you're abused as an adult?
Well, I think there are different forms of abuse. And, so say incestuous abuse is not the same as prison rape or stranger abuse. I think that when somebody is sexually abused when they're older, and this could be 10 years old, 14, 18, or older, there's there tends to be more self-blame. I should have done something about it. I should have been able to take care of myself, etc. Um, but you'll hear that from people who were abused quite young, and all sorts of. I heard one guy say, "I was 2 years old, but I was a very sexual 2-year-old." I thought, what?
Yeah, that's not possible.
Right. And whose voice was that saying that? It's got to be a message installed by the abuser.
Yeah, I asked that because I do talk to a lot of survivors that were abused as children, and then it happened to them again as an adult until they come to terms with the fact that they were abused and then seek help. And it happened to me in my case as well. So I just was wondering if there was a connection, or until people heal from it, is there a stamp on their head that says victim?
I think there can be, because one of the things that a lot of male survivors struggle with is my only value as a sexual object. And it's similar to something that a lot of women struggle with. If the only way, because as I said earlier, the child who's different is more likely to be isolated. And an isolated child still craves attention. And if he's not going to get healthy attention, he'll accept negative attention because it's still attention. And that can create a mindset where people feel like that's all there is to them. I'm a victim, and my only worth is in being a victim or being sexual. Can even feel as though if somebody is not interested in me sexually, that they don't like me, they don't care about me, they're rejecting me.
Not valuable. Yeah. So you talk about the ways that the loss of childhood, and I want to go back to this. So, what are some of the ways a boy loses his childhood when sexual abuse occurs?
What was your experience?
Well, I didn't realize that until much later, right? So, and I think the biggest experience was not being able to discover sex as my or sexual relations as most of my friends did. It's like I was taught something completely different at a very early age when you're very impressionable, that this was what sex was. And then later on, I don't know how to deal with it because it's embedded in my brain and in my psyche about that's what it is. And it wasn't a pleasurable thing, and it was always a violent thing, and so you get all these negative things about it. So for me, it was all about my view on sex. Are there other ways though that a childhood is stolen besides their view on sex?
Yeah, because it's shame-based, and you know, children really struggle with what does this mean about me? In the normal developmental process, whatever that is, that in a healthy developmental process, kids would figure out who they are, they would experiment, they would figure out their sexual orientation, their place in the world, but that gets interrupted. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that when abuse takes place, the developmental process stops. And it doesn't start again until people begin to work on their recovery, work on healing. So in between, that time is lost and that has to be figured out.
Wow. And when people don't deal with that for 30 plus years like me, that you're saying that time is lost, that's very sad. This is more reason why people need to come forward immediately.
And that's why I say that losses have to be grieved. You've got to grieve what was lost and then work to accept what is possible. That it is, I mean, if I want to make any point in this, it's that recovery is possible, that it's not easy, it's not simple, it's not quick, but things get better. And life gets better than anyone could imagine because you've never experienced it. But things, it's not going to be perfect. And there will be setbacks, there will be memories and flashbacks and feelings coming up. But overall, the trajectory is positive and things do get better and people are able. To me, recovery is about creating a life where your decisions, your actions, your behaviors aren't based on having been abused, where you can have healthy relationships, where you can make career choices that aren't based on feeling less than, where you can see your strengths, your creativity, your intelligence in a positive way, and not allow yourself to be put down, including by yourself.
Yeah, that's really interesting because in the last 7 years since I've dealt with it and begun my healing process, I noticed that in my professional life, I'm way more confident. I feel like I'm at the height of my value to my professionalism, my professional work, and it's quite interesting because I never felt worthy of what I was receiving before that.
Yeah,
So it's all tied to the
that's
healing
that's what I'm
process.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So we we talk you one of the interesting things you talked about is survival strategies, and I used, for example, dissociation and you what I thought was interesting, and we've talked about on this program before about survival strategies that boys use or children use. Um, But you talk about how those carry on to adulthood and affect our adulthood, and maybe that is. Can you talk about some of those things that are damaging? That we think that they're saving us at the time, but then when we carry those into adulthood, they're actually detrimental.
Well, I don't think that it makes sense to put down people's survival strategies. They're there for a reason. People dissociate for a reason, and for a child who's being abused to say, he's got limited size, strength, understanding, and power, and he's being lied to by the abuser about the nature of love, caring, sex, sexuality, and lots of other things. For this child to say, well, when the abuse was happening, I left my body, I went up to the ceiling and looked down on it, or I imagined that I had a different set of parents who were loving and kind and wouldn't hurt me. This is a phenomenally creative thing. It's because the child only has one job, and that's to get through it any way that he can until such time as he has enough size, strength, understanding, resources, and often sometimes geographical distance from the abuse so that he can begin his recovery process. My first clients who were my first survivor clients were 100% of them came from other parts of the country. You know, they would say things like, well, my family lives in Colorado. I could never do the work there. Or my abuser is still in California. And I'm sure that therapists in California had lots of clients from the East Coast who had to leave in order to get the work done, to begin the work.
Or did they leave just because they were running? In my case, I left just because I was running away from my past.
Well,
Yeah.
both of those things happen. And, I think that most addictions and compulsions and fixations begin as survival strategies. I'm in pain, I take a drink, the pain is gone. I'm hurting, I use a drug, I'm hurting less. And what's more logical than if that stops working, you do more of it until eventually you're addicted. And what was a survival strategy becomes a problem. And this is not just substances, this is, sex, this is food, this is work. For a lot of men, workaholism is a numbing strategy. It's an attempt to lessen the pain. And the solution then becomes the problem. But I don't think people deserve to be criticized for figuring out a way to get them through to a point where they can begin to deal with it.
So one point in your book, you have a list of things like this that survivors could go through. And it's interesting because I was going through the list and I was like, okay, well, pretty much all of these have happened at one time in my life, but I mean, it's not like they're consistently. So if you're always doing one thing, it's like you move on to the next thing, and so do you find that with survivors that they might be a perfectionist for a few years, and then they're conformist, and then they're a protector, and then
That can happen. I think it's more likely that when it's crunch time, people fall back on what's familiar.
So yeah, I mean, you at one point you talk about some survivors adopt an all or nothing approach to their lives, which my wife would tell you that I have done all my life. And so we see that as being connected. Is that a survival strategy, or is that just an effect of the sexual abuse?
Well, I think it comes from a feeling that you've got to get it right. When I said, like, is chocolate or vanilla the right choice? And there's no right about it, but it begins when getting it right, making the right choice was a matter of survival. And how that plays out is that it feels like everything becomes a matter of survival. And as I said, that's an exhausting way to live.
Yeah.
To get to a point where you're allowed to just have a preference is a big accomplishment. that you don't always have to get it right. I think that one of the phrases that's most useful for a lot of male survivors is to learn to say, oops, I made a mistake. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, and I think that that's tough, right? Because and when you say oops, then um, you're also admitting that you're not, you're feeling like it's your fault and you're not there, and you're back into the feelings of when you were being abused, I think, in some
And
cases.
I think one of the things that I say when I do a professional training is that it's really important for a therapist, especially a therapist for survivors, not to be defensive, to be human, not to be perfect, to own mistakes, to demonstrate that mistakes are part of life and they're not a matter of survival. So um, if I have to be perfect with my clients, they're not going to learn anything from that. They're going to just see, well, I'm less than, he's perfect. Well, that's not true on either side.
Yeah. Another point you talk about, and that was really struck with me, is that we have this view of, or at least I did, and I think most survivors do, that my abuse was sexual. It was a sexual thing that happened to me. This person was interested in me sexually. And you take great lengths to talk about that rape and abuse is a crime of violence, not a sexual crime. Why is that important for survivors to know that difference?
Well, you talked about it earlier about, defining oneself as a sexual object and one's value as a sexual object. But this is doing harm to a child. And no matter what excuses perpetrators give, what they're doing is inflicting harm onto the most vulnerable members of society. And since we're nearing the end, let me give you my little political rap that I think that all of the problems, the major problems of the world, begin with our idea that children are property. Because if something is your property, you can do anything with it. You can harm it, you can kill it, you can sell it. And if we can accept as a society doing harm to the weakest and most vulnerable members of society, we can justify anything. We can justify war, raping the planet, famine, homophobia, sexism, racism, all the other isms. It starts with the kids. And I think it's essential that we stop seeing children as property and seeing them as valuable beings to be protected and encouraged.
Mm-hmm.
And until we do that, the world is going to continue to be a mess.
I want to go on a little further and talk a little about healing, so we can go over if you have the time. But you talk about secrecy being a blocker to the healing process, and I, like a lot of survivors, was secret for a long, 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 long time. And but one of the reasons is because we're worried about how people are going to react to our story if we come clean or come forward with the story. And here's a good example. I had a guest, Wade Robson, who is a subject of Leaving Neverland, who is abused by Michael Jackson. And he opened up quite a bit in the program, and still, when we aired the program, you wouldn't believe the number of hate mail and hate comments that came through that just didn't believe them. So how can survivors handle breaking their silence or coming forward when, if they do break their silence, they're not understood? The people who haven't experienced abuse. I don't understand. I can't hear it. Or worse, just not believed.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think things are changing. They're changing slowly, not nearly quickly enough. I think one of the things that's been helpful is since we're such a celebrity-driven culture, when a famous person discloses that he was abused, that gives permission to other survivors to disclose. But it's not easy, and there's a lot of disease, there's a lot of unhealthiness in our institutions. And we want things to be simple and pretty and, kind of Disney-esque and, butterflies flying around the head and we walk off into the sunset. And real life isn't like that. And that's another reason why it's so important for survivors to meet other survivors who get it, who understand, who believe. I think one of the most powerful things for many survivors to hear is, "I believe you." That seems so simple, but it's so profound.
So you do spend some time talking about loved ones in spouses or just loved ones or family members so that would be a message for them when someone comes forward to just say those words. I think "I believe you" would be a great start, huh?
It would make a huge difference to so many people. When we do a weekend workshop for couples where at least one of the couple is a survivor, sometimes both, we make it clear that the workshops are not about figuring out ways for the partner to be a better support for the survivor. It's for both of them. And it's for both of them because both of them are affected by it. In a sense, it's like there's always a third person in the bed with the couple.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. Male survivors, many of us associate, and I talked about this earlier, sex with their abuse. And they become incapable of having real intimate relationships that include sex. How do they get past that? How do they get to a point where what's the magic pill that they can take that gets them to the healing point where they can be comfortable having sex with their spouse or their partner?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that. There isn't a magical pill. There isn't a magic wand or a quick fix. And anybody who tells you that there is, look for how they're profiting from it. I remember once I was in a museum gift shop, and one of the items they were selling in the gift shop was this little package of capsules labeled Happy Childhood Pills. Now, I bought some, but they don't work.
Yeah.
It's a hard process, and people don't always get there. But, to figure out what's really meant by intimacy and caring and love, and that it's more than simply sex, that, sometimes you start with cuddling. Sometimes you start with just holding hands, learning about healthy touch. And that there's a real difference between intimacy and assault.
Yeah, but it goes back, I think, to that endowment, that permanent, it seems, thing in your brain when you're young and you learn that this is your introduction to sex, and that's how do you get past that? You gotta almost you wish that you could erase that part so that you wouldn't have that learning. It's very hard to unlearn it, right?
Yeah, and it is a process. I mean, the first thing is to recognize that harm was done to you, to figure out the nature of the abuse, and then to kind of reject it, to get it out of there. And that's not the end because it leaves you with a void. And nobody can really face a void in life.
Mhm.
So you've got to figure out truths that work for you to replace the lies that you were taught. And your truth might not be the same as my truth. That doesn't have to be. It has to be a truth that works for you. And it's easy to say. I just said it in a minute. But the process itself is a lot more complicated and takes a lot longer. So the problems yield to healthy interaction, to with one's partner, with one's friends, with sometimes with one's family, and certainly with other survivors.
We talked a lot about group work and survivor workshops. How important are those as part of the healing process? And how do people find the right group for them?
I think they're vastly important for many people at some point in their recovery. Um, it's not usual that people will join a group right at the beginning or go to a workshop right at the beginning, although some do. It's more common for people to say, get into individual therapy first or couples work first. How do you find the right group for you? Trial and error, I guess.
I mean,
I mean,
should it be like people? I mean, if you're a male survivor, is this just your decision? Do you want a group that has males and females who have been abused as children, or do you want to stick with males, or if you're a gay male, do you want to have only gay males in your group? That kind of thing.
well, that's partially that depends on what resources are available to you. Things are more available now that we have Zoom and the
Mhm.
internet. But if all that's available in your area is a mixed group, then you do the best you can with a mixed group. If you prefer an all male group and it's available, great. But one size doesn't fit everyone.
Right.
And we
But you
use
can still heal in a male-female group, right?
oh yeah. Oh yeah. And the first time I did a workshop for male and female survivors together, one of the things that I was hearing during the farewells was women saying, I didn't know that men had feelings. I didn't know that men were people, because we buy into these stereotypes.
Yeah. And if their abusers were men, then it kind of like, okay, I could see where they could feel that way as well.
Exactly. And then there's the other thing that male survivors face that female survivors don't is that bite of the vampire stereotype that a boy who's abused grows up to be an abuser. This is, first of all, it's not true. That some boys who are abused, like some girls who were abused, grow up to become abusers. The vast majority don't. And in fact, the vast majority grow up to be protectors.
Mhm.
They'll say, consciously or unconsciously, I know what it feels like to have this done to me. And I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that this isn't done to another kid, which is very brave and generous. And I think that's why we find a lot of survivors in professions that involve child protection. teachers, police, medical field, therapists, they're putting themselves in a place to give a child what they didn't receive, which is wonderful and human and generous. But, it's a difficult process. And so male survivors have heard this stereotype that, a boy who's abused becomes an abuser. And they worry that maybe sometimes something will snap and I'll become an abuser. They worry that people will treat them as if they're an abuser. And often that happens, because people
Well,
buy into this stereotype based on nothing at all.
yeah.
And so they'd be reluctant to disclose.
Do you think that's because, so if you interview childhood sexual abuse, if they abused boys, for example, or even if they just abuse people, in jail, you find that a lot of them were abused as children. But those people in jail don't represent all the many people who were abused, and that's where people, I think, are missing that point. There's
That's what,
millions and millions who are abused, hundreds in prison. The ones in prison, yeah, they probably experienced childhood sexual abuse, but
yeah, and more than that, that the basis for that stereotype does come from prison studies of sexual offenders. And some years ago, there was a researcher I think she was in Portland, Oregon, a woman named Jan Hindman, she's since passed away, but she did a restudy of sexual offenders in prison. And what she found was that if you took away any perceived benefit, shorter prison sentence, more benefits, more resources within the prison, that most of the men recanted their disclosure that they were abused. So it was just a benefit-seeking behavior. And, yeah, some sexual offenders were sexually abused as children, but to extrapolate that into, therefore, most children who are abused will become sexual offenders, it doesn't work. That's not
right.
the way it works.
So we talked about group therapy. What about individual therapy? How important is that? And I know that I had a lot of difficulty finding the right therapist, but I finally did. How do survivors know if they should go to a counselor, psychologist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist? It's just it's there's a lot of different people out there, and when I first went to the internet, said, find me someone who specializes in male childhood sexual abuse. And wow, I found a whole gamut of people that were not necessarily the right people. So it's very daunting to look for that.
Yeah. And I think you make a good point that, there are bad therapists, there are badly trained therapists. To me, I think my belief is that the singer is more important than the song. So it doesn't matter whether it's a psychiatrist or a social worker or a mental health counselor or whatever. What's important is that the person be open, non-defensive, understanding, empathic, caring, have good boundaries, and be a good listener. And if you find somebody like that, it doesn't really matter whether they have an expertise in sexual abuse. If they're open to listening to you, then that's a valuable. I'll often hear from people, I have this great therapist, we have a really good connection, but she's not an expert in sexual abuse. Should I look for somebody who is? And my response is usually, well, if you've got this great connection and you trust this person and you're doing good work, that's valuable, you know.
Mhm.
And it may change over time. There are times when somebody might want a male therapist and other times when they want a female therapist. And, there are other aspects, but, just trust your gut about who and what is right for you, and you won't go too far wrong.
Yeah, I remember the only thing I wanted was someone to tell me I wasn't totally screwed up. And I remember I said that to my therapist, and he said, everybody's screwed up. And I was
Was
like,
that com-
okay.
was that comforting?
A little bit actually. I still remember it today, 7 years later, but it was quite the statement, because I just realized, okay, so we all have issues and we all have to look at that. And one of the last chapters of your book is called Moving On. And I thought that was really interesting. What does moving on look like for a male survivor of childhood sexual abuse?
Well, I think we've talked about that it's about making life decisions that aren't predicated by the abuse. And you'll never get to a point where it didn't happen, where it wasn't done to you, but that it's no longer going to ride you every waking and sleeping moment of your life, that your life decisions won't be predicated by it. Um, but yeah, find a good therapist. Years ago, I was doing a workshop for male survivors in Santa Cruz. And in the middle of the first morning, a guy came up to me and said, I don't think I should be here. I said, why not? And he said, well, it turns out he was an abuser. And he said, I told my therapist that it says for non-offending adult male survivors. And my therapist said to me, oh, don't worry about that. Everyone there is going to be an abuser. I, appreciated the courage of this guy coming forward and telling me and leaving, because it wasn't appropriate that he was there. But I think that the therapist should not be a therapist. That was an outrageous thing to say.
Yeah. It was, and we've covered a lot. And again, I recommend Victims No Longer to any survivor. It holds up very well today, and it's quite an amazing work. What's next for you in your work?
Well, I'm an old guy, so I'm going to continue doing the work that I'm doing because I'm passionate about it, because I love it, and I'm not interested in retirement or golf. So as long as I'm able to, I will go on doing workshops and training. And, I get to travel to amazing places and meet extraordinary people, survivors and those who care about them. And as long as I have the energy and the ability, I'm going to keep doing it. Our work isn't done. I also think that there are younger generations coming up who will be taking on the reins, and that's great,
Yep.
because there's a lot more work to be done, and it's not dependent on one or a few people.
It's
We
just
all,
begun. It's
yeah,
just begun to open up, I think.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you
Like
so much. Yeah. What did you want
I was just saying, and you're doing the work too.
Oh,
Voices Beyond
thanks.
Assault is doing the work. You know,
Yes, and it's interesting. I think that we all, there's a lot of organizations. There's not enough. There's never enough organizations that are doing the work, and I look to all of them.
I'm sorry that the work has to be done,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that more and more people are aware that the work has to be done.
Well, thank you, Mike, for joining our program today and sharing all the amazing work, and especially thank you for Victims No Longer. It's an amazing body of work that will live way after you and I are both gone. We hope you found this discussion enlightening, comforting, and helpful with your healing process. Please go to our YouTube channels and other major podcast sites for this program, as well as the other programs from Voices Beyond Assault. And please send us your comments. Leave your comments on the site. We really do value your input. Hopefully it's constructive input. There will be other information at the end of this program and on this site for ways that you can get in touch and find the book and things like that. Thanks to all you survivors out there for your continued support of programs and organizations such as Voices Beyond Assault. It's your courage that gives us all strength.
Hand on my chin, I was lost and looking in the glass of time. Was it just the wine made me cry? I hope I'm satisfied. I saw myself, an older man, folding up his paper plans and hiding it in his hands. Made me say, am I okay? Don't say too late tomorrow, too late tomorrow.